My name is Cassandra. I work with NHdocs, and I'm here with Molly Castelloe to discuss her film Vamik's Room. And um, so I just guess we'll get started. So what made you drawn to to Vamik to start having the idea to make a film about him?
Well, the film has been a long time in the making. It's taken many years. Originally, I had my own experience in psychoanalysis, and I was particularly drawn to Vamik's work because of the way in which he applies many of the psychoanalytic ideas and basic psychological insights to our understanding of groups, to many different kinds of groups. He's written extensively. Originally, one of the books that I read was his book Bloodlines. And he writes about ethnic groups and religious groups and political and nationalistic groups with a kind of very insightful understanding of the dynamics that perpetuate groups and belief systems.
Yeah, it really interested me because even in an individual treatment nowadays, psychoanalysis is not as popular as other forms of treatment. So I thought it was really interesting that his psychoanalysis could apply to group theory and people would be receptive of it, because it clearly shows that there's definitely back into his theories, and they make perfect sense when you see the film. I was actually interested, how did you decide to split up the themes, like the order of the themes, because they're so complicated and it's hard to kind of piece out. It was first, it was I think you did
Identity, group
yeah,
identity.
you did group identity, and then the mourning was also.
Yes, it was part of the challenges of making the film were actually structuring the narrative, because it is complex. His ideas, this is a man in his later part of his career, and he has worked for decades all over the world in conflict resolution by bringing representatives of enemy groups together for dialogue, and he's written extensively about it. So it was hard to piece it together in terms of a narrative. But when I interviewed him, and Jerry Fromm, who has worked with him for many years and continues working with him in the International Dialogue Initiative today, they were at the Erik Erikson Institute in Austin Riggs, the Institute for Education and Research. And Vamik had worked with Erik Erikson when he was alive. And one of his main ideas was identity. And Erikson wrote about it, for personal identity, as a sense of a person having a sense of sameness over time, or a kind of unity of self, of body, and experience. But Vamik was the senior Erikson scholar at the Erik Erikson Institute, and he took the idea of identity and applied it to groups. And so, yes, that's the first chapter, is about centered around group identity, how groups, whether it's a group of Americans or a Christian group or a racial group, how they come to have a sense of we, of oneness. So that's really a central concept of his. And the next chapter in the narrative of the film is on mourning. It's on shared mourning. And this is a huge theme. Probably the predominant theme in Vamik's work is about mourning. And it's so interesting, his own life story is very interesting, Vamik's life story, but he comes to these theories through his life story and his field work. And identity for him, a group identity, is often connected to a group's trauma, and whether or not they can work through the trauma and mourn it. And so mourning became the second sort of main idea, that group identity is formed through a sense of mourning, of whether a group has mourned their historical trauma, which all groups have, or whether it's been a difficult process of mourning, and it usually is. So then, yes, it came to the chapter of mourning, and then I think the following chapter was shared trauma, was group trauma, and looking at what that is, and what people in a group, how they identify together and share the experience of trauma. So that then became the second one, the third chapter, I believe, and then how he worked with groups and these ideas to help healing.
Yeah. Do you find it particularly relevant for Americans to understand this? Because in my study of like social work and cultural adaptations for understanding other cultures and social work, it was really interesting to me because other cultures have like a more shared sense of group identity. So if something happens to an individual, the group is more is affected. And I feel like a lot of times, like in America in particular, people are really focused on individualism. But in this day and age, like people are starting to learn more about group identity through like the Black Lives Matter movement. And I didn't know, did you see like similar themes of what's happening today in the news, like the murals being built and the statues like being taken down? It's like, seems like exactly relevant to his studies.
Absolutely. I certainly did, Cassandra. Yes. I mean, I think American culture is very polarized today and splintered. So I agree with you. It's not a unified, often it's not a unified sense of identity. And one of my interests in making the film comes from my own experience of being from the South, from the Southern United States. And growing up as a kid and feeling that when I grew up, it was, segregation was over, but there was still a lot of social segregation between people of color and whites. And as a kid, even as a kid, I knew that something was amiss. So you're right. A lot of America today, I think, is still splintered, frankly, from the Civil War, from one of our main, what Vamik would call chosen traumas.
Yeah.
We can look to the history before that and think of what happened to the Native Americans here. But yes, I agree with you. American identity is very fragmented, largely between the North and South, but between other kinds of extremes. You could say between religious extremes, the Christian groups and others, and Muslims or whatever other kinds of groups. So yes, and this also plays out in clinical work. I'm hearing that perhaps you're interested in individual clinical work as well. This always comes into the dyad, a person's history, whether they're an immigrant who has come over to this country, whether it's been a forced immigration or a chosen immigration, what their experience of race is and gender. So these group identities always inform the work with an individual as well. It took psychoanalysis a while to wake up to that. But this is where the future of psychoanalysis is going and is right now. People are writing about this, about how these experiences of history and their group histories come into the clinical experience of therapy.
So I also my background is in political science, and a lot of the studies, they focus mainly on the theory of like realism, and that basically that the military and economic might of like nation states is what decides relations between countries. And Vamik's work seems to kind of like butt up against that. Was there any scholars like you interviewed or anyone that he told you he kind of experienced in his studies that kind of like put down his ideas because they buttressed against that? Do you know anything about?
I know what you're talking about. The idea of realpolitik, right? Yeah. The idea that politics and the way political groups relate is a rational process. It's based on, like you said, military, economics, these other very realistic dimensions. And that's true. The point, I don't have a name for you, but I know he's run up against a lot of resistance. The point that Vamik is making is that there's an unconscious, there's an irrationality to how groups interact that something like realpolitik does not take into consideration, because that's a very rational kind of way of thinking about intergroup dynamics. So yeah, I think there has been resistance to his ideas, as there always will be to anything that's unconscious or irrational. There'll always be something that's pushing up against that when someone comes along with ideas about the unconscious.
Oh, and the other section that I found really interesting was the time collapse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is that one of the theories that he came, like, is there anyone else who ever came up with that theory?
No, not, and certainly, well, not that I know of, I'll say, but certainly not, there hasn't been anyone who has elaborated it in the kind of detail and systematic efforts that he has. Yes, the idea of time collapse is really the climax of my film, right? Drawing on his example of Kosovo in 1989 and how Milosevic reactivated this memory, a historic memory from 1389. And it's very interesting. We can see something very analogous today in America with the idea of let's go back to a time when we were the greatest country in the world. Even around the controversy around the Confederate monuments, you can see how some people are so attached to this history and going back and living in this history and idolizing these heroes of the Civil War. That the idea of time collapse is very relevant to the controversy around Confederate monuments and around the politics of today.
Yeah. What else? So how do you feel about this being your world premiere? What do you expect people to think?
I'm very curious. I'm very excited. Certainly, I've worked a long time on the film, and I'm very excited about it. I'm very honored to be a part of the festival, and I'm excited. I'm always excited to know what people think, to hear the response of people and what they come away with. I did want to mention that most of the work, one thing that I think is generally of interest to people when I've talked to them about these ideas is the idea of transgenerational transmission, of how we carry the history of our ancestors in us.
Yeah.
And I did want to say that most of that, a lot of what we know about how these memories of trauma are carried on is through the work with Holocaust survivors and second generation Holocaust survivors. Vamik has done this work, and his colleagues have done this kind of clinical work and interviews with people who lived through the Holocaust. I just think that's very important to say that a lot has been learned by talking to survivors of the Holocaust and their offspring.
I found it really interesting too. This wasn't in the movie yet, but in the description it said that he was working as the director for the Center for the Study of the Mind and Human Interaction. That fascinated me. I've never heard of anything like that.
Yes.
And it was in the School of Medicine, correct?
At the University of Virginia, and it is no longer functioning. I have at the beginning, before I began this project, I was at one of their last conferences in Richmond, Virginia, and heard them presenting about their work, and it was incredible. Vamik, having come from Cyprus and an island that's divided and still divided today between the ethnic Greeks and the Turks. His family was forced into a kind of ghetto when he was a young adult, and he had a roommate that was also killed, as in the film, by Greek terrorists, shot on the street. And so he grew up with these, thinking about these ideas about group identity, and then brought them over to this country. And he had worked, as I think I wrote in the description, in the South, in hospitals that were segregated. And a lot of the doctors working with Black population were immigrants. They were all immigrant doctors, and they were white, but they were immigrants. And after that, he went to the University of Virginia and began the Center for the Mind of Human Interaction, which was it's important. It was an interdisciplinary group. So psychoanalysts and psychologists were working with historians and sociologists and political theorists all over the world, with enemy groups, bringing them together to talk. And one of the things that he recognized along with his colleagues is when enemies spoke, their histories would come up, right? Their memories, the historical memories. And it was hard to get through that, to work through that, because the animosity and the feelings were present in the dialogues when there was antagonism. So yes, he ran that center, and it was one-of-a-kind center for about a decade. And now he and Jerry Fromm in the film are doing the International Dialogue Initiative, which is following some of the same work, with thinking about how large groups relate, and how to help them work through these historical antagonisms.
Yeah. And it's particularly relevant, like he had Palestinian and Israelis meet together.
Yes,
well.
yes. And as in the film, one of sort of the pivotal moments, there are several pivotal moments in his lifetime that he writes about as really transforming his thinking. One was Sadat's to the Knesset, and his
Sadat clip,
right,
was like when his mind shifted as well.
Yes, and the other, when Sadat said that 70% of the problem is psychological between Israelis and Arabs, but the other part was when he was working with Arabs and Israelis, and he noticed this one Palestinian playing with the rock, right? And the rock had the colors of the flag on it.
Yeah.
And so he was holding to his large group identity in the middle of this dialogue, and he was very anxious sitting next to the Israeli general. So he observed these kinds of things, and then theorized based on this kind of field work that he did and conducted. It very valuable field work. I feel like it's so timely, these ideas.
It really is. It really is. And then he also touched on the 9/11 memorial.
Yes.
That will, over time, develop the piece of mourning for the Americans.
Yes. Yes. In terms of writing about mourning, he writes how monuments are very important to the process of group mourning. They're not the only way we mourn, right? We mourn in so many different ways, but having a kind of physical structure that we can come together around and sort of process difficult feelings around is very important. And he writes a lot about that, and it's represented in the film too. Yes, the 9/11 memorial it wasn't completed by the time when we were filming this. So we can look back on it and evaluate how much it's helped us mourn or not.
Exactly. Well, I really enjoyed the film. I thought it was amazing. Like I said, I think it spanned a lot of different topics, like social work, psychology, political science and theory. So it really hit home for me. I just want to congratulate you on having a really amazing documentary. And I think you put a lot of good work into it and expanded my mind.
Oh, Cassandra, thank you so much.
Yeah.
It always helps to have a great subject too, right? Thank you.
But still, it took a lot for you to piece out his work and then separate it into parts and kind of like create the rolling narrative. That seemed really difficult to do because it was such a complicated subject. Yeah. So I just want to congratulate you, and it was great talking to you. So
I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Okay. I look forward to the festival.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.